Thank you so much. I don't know if this microphone is it working? Is it necessary? It's necessary and it's working. My hope is not to be much of a participant in this discussion because we do have two of the foremost experts in the world on what's going on in inside these negotiations in Iran. But I thought we would start, David, by giving people a little bit of an orientation as to how we got to this point. We have negotiations with a deadline on November 24th, and much riding on that. But how did we get to this point?
Well, first, thanks very much, and thanks for having me here. It's also great to be here with Gary. And I guess we're coming to the central question: if some things in the world that you don't think could ever, like Axe losing his mustache, have happened, do you then think that maybe Iran might give up its nuclear program?
Those negotiations were hard too, by the way.
They were, and had they had a deadline of November 24th, I'm not sure you would have made it.
Right.
We'll talk a little bit later about how hard this deadline is and whether it's for real or not. What's interesting to my mind, about the Iranian nuclear program is that to some degree it snuck up on Washington, in large part during the early days of the Bush administration. Because while everybody knew that Iran was operating in a world in which they were seeking some nuclear capability, in the years that immediately followed the Iranian Revolution, and the hostage crisis anniversary, I think, was 35 years ago just this week that it began. In those years after that, Ayatollah Khomeini did not actually pursue the weapons program at all. And it was really only after he was gone that there began to be significant interest in it. And at some point, the Iranians began not only building secret facilities, but becoming one of the big customers from A.Q. Khan, who was one of the founders of the Pakistani nuclear program, and who ultimately went into business for himself, selling the centrifuges, which are those huge floor-to-ceiling silvery machines that you see in the photographs that actually spin at supersonic speeds and enrich uranium. And Khan sold them that technology, and if he sold them what he gave the Libyans and the North Koreans, he probably also sold them an old Chinese bomb design that went with it. That was certainly one of the things that the Libyans turned over when they turned over their nuclear program. The big facility that you're going to be hearing a lot about in the next 2 weeks, about how many centrifuges are allowed to spin, how much fuel they can have, is at a place called Natanz. And it was revealed in 2000, and do I have this right, Gary, 2003? Mm-hmm. Just as the U.S. was into the beginning days of the war in Iraq. And my recollection is that when I would go in and ask questions about this and the North Korean program, because the North Koreans that same year were taking a lot of plutonium and shipping it off to produce what became their first weapons, what we kept hearing from the Bush administration was, you're focused on the wrong country. The one to worry about was Iraq. And of course, after the failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, President Bush said to me, I was White House correspondent for the Times at the time, I can't talk publicly again about another country being accused of having nuclear weapons program. He said, I can discuss it with leaders, I can discuss it with intelligence agencies, but I know everybody will stand up and say, yeah, just like in Iraq. So as it happened, we managed to invade the only one of the three countries in the axis of evil that did not seem to have an ongoing nuclear program. You actually probably could have done better with a dartboard, is my guess, in that basis. And then over the years, Iran built up considerably. The Bush administration had an opportunity to negotiate away the Iranian program when they had just a little under 200 centrifuges spinning. As we're heading into this last week, 2 weeks of negotiation, they have currently a little under 10,000 spinning and another 10,000 or so sitting ready to go. So it was a real lost diplomatic chance. But then the Obama administration came in, and they inherited a very fast accelerating program. And probably Gary is in a much better position than I am to explain where it was on the day you came in and how that looked compared to when you were in the Clinton administration.
So, as David said, when President Obama took office, the Iranians had already mastered the basic technology to enrich uranium, but the program was still small in terms of its physical scale. And for centrifuges, you need to have a large number in order to be able to produce a significant quantity of weapons-grade uranium. So the president, from the very beginning, believed that he needed to try to negotiate an agreement with the Iranians to limit their nuclear program, to limit their capacity to produce nuclear weapons, in exchange for the offer of having better relations with the United States. And the president made an effort in 2009 to do that. At the same time, we were aware that the Iranians had built yet another, or were in the process of building yet another secret nuclear enrichment plant at a place called Qom. It's called the Fordow plant. So at the same time that the president was pursuing an effort to improve diplomatic relations, we were also planning to expose this secret facility, which I think was intended to produce nuclear weapons. And all of this came to a head in 2009. And as a consequence of that, the U.S. and Iran negotiated a fairly modest agreement called the Tehran Research Reactor Agreement. And in that agreement, the Iranians would have removed most of their small stockpile of low-enriched uranium in exchange for getting fuel fabricated for a little research reactor, which was actually from the U.S. during the Eisenhower-Kennedy period, and it produces medical and industrial isotopes. Now, this is important to keep in mind because when we talk about the current negotiations, a similar kind of swap is one of the elements of what might eventually be a deal. But this Tehran Research Reactor agreement collapsed, mainly because the Supreme Leader Khamenei was not willing to part with the small amount of low-enriched uranium that Iran had produced, and President Obama then embarked on a policy that was focused on increasing economic and political pressure against Iran to increase the price they paid for pursuing their nuclear weapons program in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. And all of that came to a head with the election of President Rouhani and then Iran's willingness to begin genuine negotiations. Back in last November, an agreement was reached between Iran and the so-called P5+1, which is the U.S. and the other permanent members of the Security Council in Germany. And in the agreement, basically, what happened was Iran agreed to freeze any further nuclear activity, so they've limited the most important part of their nuclear program. In exchange, the U.S. and the other big powers agreed to freeze any further sanctions and to provide some modest sanctions relief. So these negotiations have been going on since January of this year, which is when this agreement went into effect, and we're now closing in on a deadline. And the way I would characterize the state of play in the negotiations is that we've made progress on a number of the key issues, including stronger inspections, including ways to limit Iran's ability to produce plutonium. But on the main issue, the central issue, which is limits on Iran's enrichment program, I think we're still very far apart because we're asking Iran to really drastically reduce its current enrichment capacity and to keep those limits in place for up to 20 years. And Supreme Leader Khamenei so far has insisted publicly and has told his negotiators they can't agree to any dismantlement of their current capability, about 10,000 centrifuges operating, and that they must, by in about 7 years, they must have about 20 more times centrifuges in place so that they could produce fuel for their power program. So at this stage, we're coming into the kind of final lap now when Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif will be meeting in Oman this weekend. My guess is that they probably won't be able to close this gap, but I think there's been enough progress made in these negotiations so that all the governments involved will be able to justify some additional extension, some additional period of time to try to come to an agreement.
I don't really think this is working. All right. All right, that's good.
Oh.
We need that. Who needs a stinking microphone? So, just let's boil this down to why the number of centrifuges matter.
Sure.
What it means in terms of the ability of Iran to build a nuclear weapon,
Yeah.
and the time period involved in building
Sure.
a nuclear weapon. Because there are obviously, each side has targets in their own mind as to what is important and what is a red line that can't be crossed.
Yeah. I mean, let me just sort of to explain that, there are two concepts you have to understand. One is called breakout and the other is called sneak out. Breakout means if Iran were to take its open enrichment facilities, which are declared and inspected by the IAEA and produce low enriched uranium, 5% enriched uranium, if they were to take those facilities and quickly try to dash to produce enough 90% enriched for nuclear weapons, which is about 25 kilograms, that's called breakout time. That's how long it would take them to move if they were to risk it, move very quickly to try to produce nuclear weapons with their declared facilities. And their current capacity, at least on paper, is a couple of months. If they were to kick out the inspectors and rush as quickly as they could, it would take them 2 or 3 months to produce enough for one bomb.
Where was it when you
Took office?
took office?
I would say it was probably about 2 years. So they've been able to close the gap by building and installing more centrifuges. They had, I think, about 2,000 when President Obama took office. Now they've got 10,000, so they've scaled up. And what the U.S. is trying to do in these negotiations is get Iran to agree to scale back down again, to remove most of the centrifuges that they've installed over the last 6 years, so that once again the breakout time would be a year or more. And as I said, so far Iran has refused to do that. Sneak out, which actually is the more likely route Iran would take, is building secret facilities and producing nuclear weapons in secret without any inspectors. And we know that's the more likely route because that's what Iran has tried twice already. Both of their enrichment plants started life as secret facilities until they were exposed and Iran was forced to put them under safeguards, under international inspection. So part of the negotiations is an effort on our part to get the Iranians to agree to additional inspection and monitoring measures which would enhance our ability to detect cheating in the future. So the two key pieces of these negotiations are physical limits on Iran's declared nuclear facilities in terms of numbers and types of centrifuges, and then limits in terms of inspection and monitoring, so we can improve our ability to actually find secret facilities.
Let me just say something about the secret facilities for a moment, because it's a fascinating subject, and one in which we're not very good over time. As Gary mentioned, we missed the Natanz facility until it was revealed by an Iranian dissident group. When the Fordo facility came up, it was actually discovered by some foreign intelligence services first, and then the U.S. and Israel together. But it was pretty far along, I think, by the time the Bush administration became aware of it. And I think, Gary, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think by the time the Obama administration came in, it was pretty well ready to be briefed up to all of you. But it had been a while before they found it. And so the chances that you can actually find a facility in a country that's got a huge number of caves, lots of underground capability, good experience at hiding this stuff, is relatively low, and it's what makes that part of the agreement all the more important. It's also the part of the agreement that's least discussed in Washington. Usual rules apply. People spend more of their time discussing the least part of the problem, right? So the Natanz facility that you're going to hear about, where most of those centrifuges are, it's got cameras on it, it's got inspectors in and out of it every day. It'd be really hard for the Iranians to go pull a fast one there. But doing it in a facility that you don't know about, that's another issue.
Well, let's go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to comment on that. I mean, the reason why people don't talk very much about this sneak out option, the secret facilities, is because the way that we monitor and detect those facilities is through our intelligence agencies and our cooperation with our allies that are trying to do the same thing, Israelis, British, French, Germans, and so forth. I mean, I would say that in relative terms, and everything is relative, our capacity against Iran in terms of detecting secret nuclear activities is much better than, say, North Korea, where we have virtually no capacity. Or the case of Iraq, where we missed a huge nuclear weapons program before 1990, and then thought there was one when there wasn't one when we invaded in 2002. So any nuclear deal we do with Iran is going to fundamentally depend upon our ability to continue to monitor what they're doing through national means. And there's a connection between the overt and the covert. If they have a huge overt enrichment program with thousands of centrifuge machines, that makes it easier for them to hide a smaller secret facility because they'll be training hundreds of people, they'll be producing thousands of components, and it's easier, to divert some of that stuff to build a secret facility than if they have a very small, constrained, declared facility. So there's a connection between the two. Although, as David says, the big focus is on number of types of centrifuges and breakout capacity, which is probably the least likely threat we would face from Iran.
So the Israelis, and there's great anxiety in Israel about this program, and other opponents of this drift pin a lot of that argument on lack of trust, that there isn't 100% verifiability. What is your level of confidence that you say we have much better capacity, but what's your level of confidence that any agreement is ultimately verifiable?
I think that if we had an agreement which gave the international inspectors additional access and required Iran to provide additional information about what they were doing, that would give us a better likelihood of finding secret facilities than if we didn't have an agreement. But certainly no agreement can be 100% certain. And we have to assume that the Iranians, since we've been so successful in detecting their secret facilities, we have to assume they're going to try to figure out better ways to hide it the next time. And I think there's a risk that even if an agreement is done, we have to keep a very close watch on what they're doing in their nuclear program, because they're not likely, in my view, the Supreme Leader is not likely to give up his ultimate ambition to have a nuclear weapons capability, something which he's been pursuing for almost 30 years. So the issue to me is not whether you're going to be certain, but whether you improve your chances. And I think an agreement would improve our chances.
So, David, you hinted before that, or you opened up the possibility, and Gary certainly said that you don't think necessarily the 24th is a hard deadline. I assume you both think there's a high likelihood that there'll be an extension?
I do. I think the question is what kind of extension there would be. So, first of all, why do we think that this deadline isn't hard? Well, it's in neither country's interest right now to let this whole effort fall apart. Right? The sanctions relieved, and if the negotiations completely fell apart, those sanctions, which have cut their revenues by about 60%, and kept them from being able to conduct international banking and so forth, it's probably the most successful sanctions regime I can remember ever seeing the United States enact, and much more successful than what happened during the Bush administration. I think more successful than what the Obama administration thought it would be.
Well, it's certainly more successful than the critics suggested at the time.
At
There's
the
a great
time.
deal of skepticism.
Well,
about
one
it.
of the remarkable things is that Israeli officials said to us at the time, these sanctions will never work. And I just, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was over in New York for the UN last month, I spent some time with him. I spent some time with his aides, and they're all saying, well, whatever you do in these agreements, don't lift the sanctions. It's what's keeping the Iranians from doing much here. So there is a little bit of an oddity there. And then there was another element of this, which we can discuss later. I can discuss later, Gary can't, which was that there was an extremely effective U.S. sabotage program, cyber sabotage program.
I read about that in the New York Times.
You read about that in the New York Times. I'm guilty of that, yes. That's a fascinating first use of cyber weapons against another state by the U.S. And so all of these things together make the Iranians realize that we have ways of making the program difficult and making their life difficult if the negotiations collapse. Now, President Obama also has reasons not to want to make this collapse. I mean, first of all, there are not a lot of wins on the foreign policy scoreboard since Axelrod left Washington, okay? So this is the single biggest thing. And if you think he's probably not going to defeat ISIS during his time there, that the Syrian civil war isn't likely to come to an end, that, you know, by the time President Obama leaves office, we will not have resolved all of our issues with Vladimir Putin or with the Chinese, right? This is the biggest single thing that he could sort of have as a major foreign policy accomplishment in the second term. And so he has an interest in making sure this doesn't fall apart. So I think if they can say we've made a fair bit of progress and maybe even lay out a sort of framework of an understanding, they could do that. Now, there are a lot of people in the White House who are concerned about doing that because they think that if they don't have the details, Congress will come back and eat them alive for saying, well, this is a very nice little framework, but tell us how this is going to work, and they won't be able to answer that yet.
Well, now that you've raised Congress, there was an election the other day.
I heard about that. Yeah.
I read about that in the New York Times.
Yeah.
And now
Talk about things that went to hell since you left Washington.
Yeah.
Right? Was this your fault?
Why do you think
right?
I left? Just so, as you know, the administration's been trying to hold back the Congress, not just Republicans, but some Democrats, including the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, from imposing further sanctions on Iran. What does the election of a Republican Senate do to this process and to the psyche of the Iranians as they look at the American political constellation now?
I mean, I think that, first of all, I don't think it's the most important factor in blocking agreement. I think the most important factor blocking agreement is the fundamental disagreement between the U.S. and Iran over what kind of nuclear threshold capacity Iran will have. But I do think the election will affect Iranian calculations. I think they will clearly see Obama as weaker and therefore probably less able to defend any agreement. And I think that probably makes them even more unlikely to concede to the kind of really tough demands that we're making, because they wonder whether President Obama is going to be able to defend any agreement against Congress.
I would agree with that, but add one more to it, which is the current plan for the administration, although they get unhappy when you write it this way, is for the president to suspend the sanctions for the first couple of years, probably through the rest of his presidency, and not go to Congress to actually lift them and reverse them until it's clear whether the Iranians are living up to an agreement. And in my mind, that makes perfect sense, because you wouldn't want Congress to go lift the sanction, and then if you had to reimpose it, you've got to bring it to Congress again. The president, if he suspends them by the stroke of a pen, and he can do that with many, not all, he could then reimpose them by a stroke of a pen. But I think that the Iranians have to be nervous that a Republican-controlled Senate would be less likely to ultimately lift these sanctions, even if they complied and did everything perfectly. And we have to say, the Iranians have done, in the interim agreement that was reached a year ago, when they agreed to blend down some of their nuclear material and slow down some of their enrichment capability, they have done everything that they signed up to do, with the single exception of letting the international inspectors understand what the history of the program was when it was in full bloom prior to 2004. They have not allowed any of the architects of the program to be interviewed. They have not let the inspectors get into sites they've been looking to see.
And just to say, one of the other big problems or obstacles in these negotiations is that the Iranians are demanding that the sanctions laws have to be repealed. They don't want to live 6 months at a time under presidential waivers. And obviously that's something that the White House simply cannot promise to do. So that's another reason why I think it's unlikely that a deal will be reached at the end of November.
The other thing is, the president's problems here on sanctions lifting are not just with Republicans.
Right.
Some of the most vociferous critics of lifting this are Democrats. And you know, Israel has done an extraordinarily good job in Congress in doing some very, very sophisticated lobbying on this issue as well. And so the way the Israelis portray the agreement may be as important to many in Congress, particularly from some districts, as the way the administration does.
And we've heard the Israelis openly talking about the need not to make an insufficiently strong agreement.
And my sense from talking to the Israelis is that they recognize that the interim agreement is working well. As David said, Iran has complied with all of the commitments they made to limit or freeze their nuclear activities. And we've been able to sustain the most important element of the sanctions regime, even though we've eased some of the sanctions. It really hasn't collapsed. And the big fear that Israel had last year when this agreement was reached is that once you start to ease some of the sanctions, all businesses will want to rush back in to do business with Iran, and the sanctions regime will simply collapse. That hasn't happened at all. In fact, the big complaint in Iran, which the Supreme Leader has to deal with, is hardliners saying, we've frozen our nuclear program and we haven't gotten any real sanctions relief in return. So just as President Obama will face some critics at home if he tries to extend this deal, there will be critics in Iran as well who will be urging the Supreme Leader to get out of it and resume their nuclear activity if they calculate they're strong enough to withstand any effort by the U.S. to resume sanctions.
So your view, and you've stated and you've hinted at it here, is that the stasis is maybe the best situation we could have. But how long is that sustainable?
It's very hard to predict. I mean, the last time there was a nuclear deal, it was a deal between Iran and 3 of the European powers. And again, Iran agreed to freeze some of its nuclear activities. That deal lasted from 2003 to 2005, and then the Iranians reneged. So that was a 2-year deal. This deal might last 2 years, might last 5 years. It'll depend on Iran's calculation of whether they think they can walk away from the deal with relative impunity. And that will depend on their calculation of the economic situation and the broader international situation.
We're also at a different political moment. They're under much more economic pressure than they were when that deal happened. The sanctions there had been virtually no sanctions against Iran that were nuclear related at that time. So that's the first. The second is, we now have some common interests, if not common projects. So if you believe what you read in the Wall Street Journal this morning, or this afternoon, the president has written...
Showing his broad-mindedness.
I'm
now.
very broad-minded. I read, all kinds of stuff comes into my iPhone. They wrote a very good story saying the president had written what I think would be a 4th letter to the Supreme Leader. The last 3 didn't result in terribly satisfactory dialogues, as I recall. But a letter that basically, I think, laid out why he should take this fuel swap deal that Gary alluded to and I wrote about in Monday's paper, which was basically ship much of their fuel to Russia, have Russia turn it into fuel for the Bushehr nuclear reactor, the one commercial reactor they have. Once it's in that form, it's very hard to turn back into a weapons fuel. So if the Iranians were willing to do that, then you could allow them to have more centrifuges because they'd have less fuel to process. And so I think part of this letter was probably to convince, I don't know this, the Supreme Leader to take that deal. But the other thing the letter said, or so the Journal reported, was, look, once we get this deal, then we can talk about doing something with ISIS, and we have no intention of going back and reoccupying Iraq. Don't worry about that. Been there, done that, didn't work out so hot. And so there are a lot of other things we can begin to work on. I think the Iranians have a very fundamental question to answer. It's the question that Henry Kissinger once raised about Iran, which is they have to decide if they want to be a country or a revolution. If they want to be a country, they'll probably want to sign the deal and move their way on to economic integration. If they want to be a revolution, and many around the Supreme Leader and many in the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps want that to be the animating reason for the Iranian state, then they might not take the deal.
I think the key question for extension is what the terms are. And I think it'll be very difficult. I think it's possible, but difficult to negotiate terms. We will want additional nuclear constraints in exchange for additional modest sanctions relief, and the Iranians will want to maximize sanctions relief in exchange for much more modest nuclear constraints. Now it is possible that the two sides will come to an agreement, and if there is an extension, it might be a short extension to try to negotiate those terms. But I think it's also possible that the Supreme Leader will miscalculate. I think as he looks at the world, he thinks the U.S. is in a weak position. The P5+1 are divided over the Ukraine crisis. He thinks the rise of ISIS has made the U.S. more dependent on Iran in order to manage the situation in Iraq. He thinks the Iranian economy has stabilized because there haven't been additional sanctions. And he may make the mistake, I think it would be a mistake, of walking away from the status quo in order to revive the nuclear program. And I think we're actually in a pretty good position to increase sanctions, especially because of the fall in oil prices.
What happens if he does miscalculate? What happens if these talks break down? What options exist? What do the Israelis do? What is the likelihood of an attack on Iran?
Well, let me just pick up quickly on what I was saying. And there are only 4 countries in the world that buy a really significant amount of oil from Iran: Japan, Korea, India, and China. And with the current oil market, I think we're in a very good position to persuade at least our allies to further reduce their purchases of Iranian oil. And that's the strongest economic card that we have. The Chinese are more difficult, but certainly the Koreans, Japanese, and Indians have been very responsive to political messages from Washington to reduce their purchases of oil from Iran. What the Iranians do is the interesting question. They will certainly resume the nuclear activities that they froze under the current interim agreement, but whether they take another step toward producing nuclear weapons, like producing higher enriched uranium or something else, I think that's unlikely. I think the Iranians are very careful about taking actions which could trigger an attack from the U.S. or from Israel. And even before the interim agreement, they were doing things in their nuclear program that was specifically designed to reduce the risk of a military attack. So my guess is that even if the talks break down, the Iranians will certainly step up their program. They'll keep creeping toward having a much more potent nuclear capability, but I don't think they'll run the risk of overtly trying to dash toward a bomb, because the likelihood of that triggering an attack from the U.S. or Israel is too high.
I would agree with this, but I think it's important to remember that when you hear the Israelis talk about what their objectives are, and you hear President Obama, there's a slight difference in the wording there. So President Obama will say, we will not let Iran obtain a nuclear weapon. And when you ask him, and we did an interview in 2009, I think you were sitting in on that, Terry, at the time, does that mean you will not let them have a threshold capability, get up to the edge of being able to build one, so that with a few turns of the screwdriver they could go do it? The president said, I won't parse that for you, right? And I don't think he's ever publicly parsed that. And when you ask the Israelis the question, they say, look, we don't think the Iranians are going to race for an actual weapon. We think they just want the threshold capability. Because in the modern world, having that threshold capability is as useful as having the weapon itself. In fact, it's more useful, because having the weapon brings all sorts of bad news to you. Ask the North Koreans. But having the capability leaves enough ambiguity that it's possible that many others will say, well, you're still technically within the treaty. And lots of countries have a threshold capability. Japan has a threshold capability to build a weapon. I mean, obviously they've got the technological capability, and they certainly have the supply, but we don't sit around and worry about it, right? So the Iranians are very smartly saying, we just want to be allowed to do what the Japanese can do.
And so neither of you believe that a bomb is imminent. I want to get to some questions in a minute, but talk a little bit about why this has become such a critical issue for American foreign policy. Given what you just said, what are the dangers here that motivate such intense interest on the part of our policymakers?
Well, I mean, let me say, first of all, I'm not as confident, or I am not confident that Iran would stop with a threshold capacity. I think if they had a real option to produce nuclear weapons, I think it's very likely that the current government in Iran would take that option and they would do it. Because they see, I think the Supreme Leader believes that nuclear weapons are very desirable, both to defend himself against the great Satan, and he knows the history of the U.S. We have a tendency to bomb and invade countries that don't have nuclear weapons, but those that do, we tend to leave them alone. So I think he genuinely believes that nuclear weapons are a good thing to have. And he also thinks having nuclear weapons gives Iran a much stronger ability to intimidate their neighbors. So I'm afraid that if Iran ever got to a threshold state, they would slip over the edge and actually build nuclear weapons.
And then what do the neighbors do?
That would clearly stimulate the neighbors, and they've been very open in terms of saying we can't live under Iran's nuclear shadow. So King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia and others have indicated that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, they will have to do so as well. The Middle East is messy and violent enough without having a number of countries with nuclear weapons, which I think would increase the risk of a nuclear conflict. And secondly, with nuclear weapons comes responsibility to protect and control them. And given the instability in the region, we just couldn't be confident that one or more of those countries would lose control of their nuclear weapons and they would end up in the hands of terrorist groups.
We've already got that concern with Pakistan, and this would be a similar one. Prince Turki, who's the intelligence chief in Saudi Arabia, gave a speech in Washington last week, and he's back next week, so it'll be interesting to hear him again. And during the course of this speech, he had one line in it in which he basically said, the Americans should know that whatever it is they ultimately end up allowing the Iranians to produce in this agreement, we will also produce. So he was sort of putting everybody on notice that if you let the Iranians go this high, we're going this high. If you let them go this high, we're going this high. And so that arms race element is already there. Now, the other question is, could somebody just turn around and buy a weapon? And that's another part of the covert concern, both for Iran and for Saudi Arabia. The Saudis helped fund the project that A.Q. Khan, who I mentioned at the opening in Pakistan, had going. They spent millions of dollars to help the Pakistanis develop the technology for a weapon. Now, maybe they did this because they considered it charitable giving for the year. But a lot of
Did you
people.
get a write-off for that? I don't even know.
I don't know. We ought to check, and it's worth trying. So a lot of people believe that if the Saudis actually needed a weapon in a hurry, that they have a quiet agreement with the Pakistanis. I've never seen any evidence of that, but it's reasonable to assume, just given their earlier role in it. The Iranians have a long business relationship in the missile arena with the North Koreans, and periodically get invited to be tourists at the nuclear tests that the North Koreans have been conducting. And so it's entirely conceivable that if the Iranians needed another way out of this, they might turn to North Korea, which of course helped Syria build a reactor that the Israelis destroyed in September of 2007. So there are all kinds of things that could go haywire if an agreement fell apart.
Let me ask a last question, then I want questions from the audience. Given everything that you've said and your observation of this process and the discordant politics of that region, what are the odds that 5 years from now more countries will have nuclear weapons, and what are the odds of a weapon actually being used in the next 5 or 10 years, if not by a state actor, but then by a non-state actor?
I mean, the good news is that we've been remarkably successful in terms of preventing non-state actors from our nuclear materials. In the entire history of the nuclear age, since 1945, it's never happened. All the countries that have nuclear weapons so far have protected them effectively enough so that it hasn't fallen into the hands of non-state actors. And that's one of the reasons, of course, why President Obama has emphasized the importance of strengthening nuclear security. So I'm less worried about that. In terms of the risk of nuclear war, I think South Asia probably is where I would think the risk is the highest, because you have two adversaries that have fairly robust nuclear arsenals, and they're engaged in a conflict over territorial disputes with a dose of terrorism, thrown into it as well. In the Middle East, I think we still have good options to delay any further nuclearization. I mean, I think our diplomacy, our covert operations, our sanctions, our threats of force has delayed Iran's ability to acquire nuclear weapons, and I think we still have time to play that out. I mean, I'm convinced that if it hadn't been for actions the U.S. has taken, Iran would have nuclear weapons today. And I think we very successfully at least postponed the problem. The other countries in the region, unless they're able to buy nuclear weapons or material from Pakistan or North Korea, they really don't have any indigenous capability. They just don't have the skilled people or scientific or nuclear establishments. So it isn't possible for them in the next 5 years to produce nuclear weapons themselves.
I think when the history of the Obama administration is written, the program to reduce the amount of loose nuclear material, the nuclear safety program, will go down as one of the big accomplishments. The number of countries that just had high enriched uranium sitting in old reactors, or hospital waste, or low enriched uranium sitting around, has been significantly reduced. Those numbers are impressive. The president's ability to deliver on his own promises to make the United States less reliant on nuclear weapons than ourselves, I think that's been less impressive so far. But the nuclear cleanup side has been important, because that's really where terror groups would obtain some nuclear material. Not even to build a nuclear weapon, but just to build a dirty bomb, a terror, which is a dirty bomb is basically radioactive material that you wrap some TNT around and blow it up and just make a few square blocks of an area uninhabitable for many years. You can sow a lot of fear doing that. But I think the other thing to remember about the Iranian nuclear program, if you can get this one solved, you have unlocked the key, or at least created the potential, for actually reordering the Middle East. Because we do have a number of common interests with the Iranians. And if you go talk to young Iranians, they all want the nuclear deal, not because they want to give up nuclear capability, they're proud of their country's nuclear capability. They want to come here. They all want to apply to the University of Chicago. They all want to show up in the
And
loop.
who wouldn't?
And who wouldn't, right. You know, they all want to go to New York. And basically, they have an incredibly young, incredibly sophisticated, incredibly well-educated populace that feels completely hemmed in by these sanctions. And they could care less about how many centrifuges they have. Mm-hmm. They just want enough self-respect here that they haven't had to back down to the West and move on to the next issues and get on those airplanes.
And part of the reason why the hardliners in Iran oppose a nuclear deal is precisely for that reason. The last thing they want is the Iranians come to the University of Chicago and pick up dangerous ideas about democracy and personal freedom.
Do we have some questions?
Especially in light of how we've wrecked Iran's economy for a failed sanctions policy, other than our unconditional commitment to Israel's foreign policy objectives, does Iran, even with nuclear weapons, pose a threat to any United States strategic interests?
Well, I think it does. I mean, as I was describing, the Middle East is already an incredibly unstable and violent place where U.S. national interests in terms of energy and support for Israel are jeopardized. And if Iran got nuclear weapons, it would, I think, directly make the protection of U.S. national interests much more difficult. And so I wouldn't say the sanctions policy has failed. I agree with you that we have not been able to compel Iran to accept our tough demands for a nuclear deal. I agree with that. But I do think the sanctions have been effective in at least forcing Iran to freeze its nuclear program. And that's an important achievement. We're buying time. We're postponing the day in which Iran would have available an option to produce nuclear weapons.
Any other questions? Yes.
I want to ask the journalist, sorry, because you're the only one who may speak openly about it. Is the Israeli-U.S. agreement, disagreement, a real big gap, or is it a good cop, bad cop? Like, we have these other guys that will bomb you if you don't, are U.S. and Israel coordinated, or are they really disputed about this?
I think it's a real disagreement. It's not a disagreement on the intelligence itself. If you sit down and you talk to American intelligence officials to the degree that they will be honest with somebody like me, and you sit down and you talk to the Israelis on this, they will give you very similar assessments of where they believe the Iranians are, how close they are to a weapon, and they may have some disagreements about how long, once the Iranians got the fuel, that it would take them to actually turn it into a weapon itself. But there have been times, actually, Gary, tell me if I'm right on this, where in my reporting I've had Americans pose a more dire outcome of how long, how short a time period that could be, than I've heard from Israelis. Okay? Where the real difference is how you then interpret what you're willing to tolerate. Now, the Israelis make the following 3 points. First, they live within Iranian missile range. We don't. That changes their view. Secondly, there has been a lot of discussion among Iranian leaders, who knows how much they believe it, about the illegitimacy of the Israeli state, the need to go back and reclaim all those lands and so forth. But that, to the Israelis, sounds existential, and they deal with it as such. And I think the third, and perhaps the biggest difference, is that we are probably willing to live with that ambiguity about whether or not the Iranians could race to a weapon more freely than the Israelis are, in part because we have different equipment. So one of the facilities that Gary referred to before was a place called Fordow, which is built, it's an enrichment facility built deep inside a mountain on an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps base. Unless the Israelis have improved their capability in ways that I'm not aware of, they don't have a way to get inside that one. And that's why they're so particularly concerned about it. We have one giant bunker busting weapon that requires a B-2 to deliver it because it weighs so much, that if you believe American military officials, would probably work at getting down into that. And we're not about to go leave it on the table with keys to a B-2 for the Israelis. So the Israelis feel as if we're holding the last key to be able to destroy the program. We would need to be a part of that.
Well, why don't we save yours for the end, and young man in the back there.
In the picture of uranium behavior that has been sketched out so far, it seems that strategic considerations are animating the uranium. Is there any credence to the idea that at least parts of Iran want capability for, say, astrological reasons?
I'm sorry, could you say again? I didn't
The
quite
last
understand.
word was,
For, like, say, eradicating Israel, or for things like related to the 12 coming of the 12 Imam.
I'm not sure I got it. Are you asking whether Iran really wants to eradicate Israel?
Whether, basically, what's gaining uranium behavior?
Oh,
Are these purely strategic considerations, or like, are there more irrational elements?
I mean, I think they're strategic. You know, I think this is a long-term program that dates back to the mid-1980s when they first acquired centrifuge technology from Pakistan. And as I said, I think it's motivated both by a sense of national defense, that this is the best way to protect themselves against enemies that have nuclear weapons, like the United States. And it's also motivated by a sense that Iran should be the dominant power in the region. And in many ways, they have the most capabilities in terms of population and so forth. And they think having nuclear weapons would give them more prestige and status, and therefore make it easier for them to dominate the region. So I think, you know, looking at the world from, you know, Khamenei's standpoint, it's perfectly understandable why he thinks it makes sense to have nuclear weapons. But I also think, you know, the Iranians have been quite cautious about how they proceed. They have not been reckless, unlike other countries. Like Saddam Hussein was terribly reckless the way he proceeded. And other countries, like the North Koreans, have felt compelled to move very quickly to get nuclear weapons because they felt so vulnerable. I think Iran's program is a long-term program, which is, you know, they're going to move slowly and carefully. And therefore, I think we have options to continue to delay it, and maybe with different leadership, we might even be able to persuade the government of Iran to, you know, stop at some point, you know, below having nuclear weapons or a nuclear weapons threshold.
You know, David said something interesting earlier about quoting Kissinger about whether they want to be a revolution or whether they want to be a government. It seems like they have both going on at the same time.
Exactly right.
And right now, the revolutionary forces are the dominant forces, the theocratic forces. Is there a possibility of that balance shifting?
well, I think it's a little bit difficult, at least it's a little bit difficult for me, to figure out exactly where that power balance is, because the new Iranian government, after Ahmadinejad was out, President Rouhani and his foreign minister, are definitely in the, we want to be a government, we want to integrate with the West. If you listen to them, they quote from the Supreme Leader. They try to stay within boundaries that he's set. They would not walk back one moment when he declared he wanted basically the equivalent of 190,000 centrifuges. But they're sitting there conducting these negotiations with a knowledge that they want a deal that will reintegrate them, and then they know they have to go back and sell it to the Supreme Leader. The problem is that the biggest players in deciding the deal in Iran are not sitting in Oman this weekend and will not be in Vienna for the end game. So At some point, they're going to have to go back to the supreme leader. At some point, they're going to have to go back to the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which oversees the military side of the program. And they're going to have to persuade them that the upside of getting sanctions lifted, even temporarily, is greater than the downside of moving ahead with the program.
And I think that's exactly right. And my fear is that we'll see a repeat of the Tehran research reactor deal, where the U.S. negotiated an agreement with representatives of the Iranian government in great detail, and the supreme leader decided he didn't like it, and he overruled it. And I think the supreme leader is a committed revolutionary. Until he goes, I think it's unlikely we'll see a resolution of this tension between Iran acting as a revolution or acting as a government.
When you're called the supreme leader, it gives you a certain level of authority that gets people's attention. Yes, couple more questions here, and Y Square, I'm going to get to you.
Could you talk a little bit about the effectiveness of economic sanctions, and how new is it as a policy? Is the jury still out, or do you think this might be another effective weapon we can use?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and as David said, I think the sanctions against Iran have been particularly effective. And the reason for that is because Iran depends so heavily on oil exports. I mean, that's a major part of their government revenue. And we've been able not only to persuade their customers to reduce purchases from Iran, in part because some of Iran's enemies, like Saudi Arabia, have deliberately increased production in order to replace Iran's sales, but also, and this is a new one, which I think the Treasury Department has carried out brilliantly, we've been able to use financial sanctions so that Iran can actually they get by selling the oil. So they've got something like $100 billion or more money that's locked up in banks in Japan or Korea or India, which they can't access because those banks don't want to run the risk of getting sanctioned by the U.S. by allowing transfers to take place. And we've used that frozen money as part of these negotiations. So, for example, we've allowed Iran to get access to something like $500 million a month in exchange for the nuclear constraints they're taking. So I wouldn't say that these kinds of sanctions can be reproduced. For example, in the case of Russia, I think it's much less likely that we'll be able to impose the same kind of effectiveness. But certainly in the case of Iran, I think all of the right elements were in place, and I think President Obama was very effective as a leader in terms of convincing other leaders, especially in Europe, to join him in taking these actions. So I think he deserves a lot of credit for putting in place the sanctions regime.
There are a couple of things that I think are distinctive in this. The U.S. got better at sanctions when they started going after North Korea and some banks in Macau in particular, and they learned some techniques. And one of them Gary alluded to, which is the financial technique of going to a bank, a major bank, and saying, okay, guys, you have to make a choice. If you want to go do business with Iranian banks, be my guest, but we will then bar you from ever clearing any of your transactions in dollars in the United States. So take your pick, and you might want to do a little graph and see how big the Iranian economy is and how big the U.S. economy is, and check with your controller about how long you would stay in business if you couldn't clear transactions in dollars through the Fed, and then come back and chat with us. And that was a brilliant insight nobody had really had until about midway through the Bush administration, and President Obama persuaded the architect of it to stay a few years into his time. The second thing about sanctions that's important is they only work if you get everybody else to sign up. If you try them one-on, we have a lot of countries, the U.S. sanctions, including Cuba. Well, that's worked really well since we've had the sanctions since, I think, sometime in the middle of 1962. And you'd think at some point somebody would conduct a review of a policy that hasn't worked in 60 years and ask whether there may be a reason out here, okay? So those two can be held out. There was also some very creative diplomacy done with the Chinese. Some of Gary's colleagues, and maybe Gary himself, I don't recall him this, went to China at various moments and said, we understand that you want the oil from Iran. We get that. By the way, let's just have a little discussion about if we can't keep the Israelis at bay, if there actually is an attack on Iran, if the Iranians respond by closing down the entire Persian Gulf to punish everybody else and keep oil getting out, let's do a little calculation about how much oil you'll have to live without. So they basically said to the Chinese, you would be wiser to participate in these sanctions and put the slow squeeze on them than face a crisis in the future. And the Chinese, being ultimate pragmatists, I think, signed on to that. They have, around the edges, they have increased their purchases of oil, but as Gary indicated before, there's a lot of oil in the market right now, so they don't have to push the envelope.
There was a, yes. I'll take that question and then one more question. I'm getting the hairy eyeball I can see.
I think you may have mentioned this in passing, but can you talk a little bit more about whether the U.S. This need for Iran's help against ISIS will give them any leverage in the talks?
Yeah, I think, the Iranians certainly believe it will, and my understanding is that in some of the discussions, the Iranian negotiators have basically said, if you give us a generous deal on the nuclear issue, if you meet our demands, then we will help you, defeat ISIS. And the administration has rejected that because the nuclear issue is so important on its own, but also to some extent, the Iranians are acting against ISIS because it's in their own national interest, not as a favor to the United States. But I do think at the end of the day, I think our ability to effectively carry out our campaign in Iraq is going to depend on Iran at least not opposing what we're trying to do. And in particular, we're trying to encourage the new Iraqi Prime Minister, al-Abadi, to make a political accommodation with the Sunnis and the Kurds so that they can fight with us against ISIS. And I think unless the Iranians are prepared to tolerate that, it probably won't happen. So, we have an interest, I think, in at least avoiding a confrontation with Iran over the nuclear issue so that we can focus on, battling ISIS. But at the end of the day, I'm not sure the U.S. and Iran are really going to be truly able to partner together because we have very different ideas about what the politics of Baghdad should look like.
It gets even more complicated when you get to Syria. Okay, so the Iranians are the ones who have been supporting Assad, and we have said Assad's got to go. But in recent months, I would say that the enthusiasm inside the White House for seeing Assad go has diminished quite dramatically because they're quite concerned that if he does, the whole country fractures up, ISIS takes pieces of the country, and in case anybody hadn't noticed, these moderates we've been talking about arming for the past 2 years don't seem to be doing a terribly effective job. So if we're going to be the air power in Syria, someone's going to have to be the ground power. And that's either going to have to be the Iranian-backed forces of Assad or the Iranians themselves, most likely. And so there is some common interest. And that's why it would be really interesting to see how President Obama worded his references to ISIS in that letter, if it ever becomes public. We're counting on David to get a copy of it for the Obama Library if it comes here, and put it in the lobby where we can all read it. But I can tell you, I'm
First
sure
we've got to get the library. Then
that's the first step, right? I'm sure that was probably the most heavily edited paragraph in the letter.
Yeah, you would know, but there's probably quite a bit of craftsmanship on those.
There's quite a bit of craftsmanship, and you wonder because we're, of course, writing in English, and the Supreme Leader doesn't read English, so when somebody translates it into Farsi, you sometimes wonder whether something gets lost.
That's a comforting thought. So we had such a eloquent introduction to this program that we at least owe it to the introducer to close us out tonight.
Thank you. undeserved kindness and adds to the pressure. I'd like to ask about what role might Russia actively or inadvertently play in terms of nuclear non-proliferation, especially in the context that first Ukraine is a sovereign nation that gave up its nuclear weapons. On the other hand, the recent news that Russia announced that it's boycotting the next nuclear security summit. Thank you.
So, I'm afraid the nuclear security summit is going to be a victim of, geopolitics. I mean, we took actions against Russia because they invaded Ukraine. The Russians have now responded by taking actions of their own, which I think is unavoidable. And one of those actions is that they say they're going to boycott the last nuclear security summit in 2016. I think that could be reversed if there was a political settlement in Ukraine. But unfortunately, it doesn't look to me like Putin is interested in a political settlement between Kiev and the rebels in the eastern part of the country. I think he's most likely is in favor of continuing to keep the situation as a so-called frozen conflict, which he can then use as pressure against Kiev if they start making moves toward being, closer to Europe, to the EU or to NATO. So I think it's really unfortunate, but probably there's no way to prevent it. On the case of Iran, the Russians have in fact been quite supportive of U.S. policy, and I think they do that because it's in their national interest. They don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons. They don't want the talks to break down, which would increase tensions. And in a funny way, they actually don't want the talks to succeed, because the Russians have always been nervous that better relations between Tehran and Washington would hurt them, because it would take away a market that they really have all to themselves. So I think the Russians like the status quo very much. They like things to be, quiet, without a breakthrough and without a breakdown.
Gary's exactly right here. Trying to figure out the Russian motivations in the case of Iran will make your head hurt. Okay, so on the one hand, they built the Bushehr reactor, and they made a lot of money building it. They provide the fuel for the reactor, and they make a lot of money providing the fuel. So they're not terribly interested in the Iranians building up their own fuel capability. They have made this offer to take the Iranian-made fuel, which is wildly more expensive than the fuel that Russia could make itself, and turn it into the fuel rods and send it back, in part because it would extend their monopoly, and they could make a lot of money at that. On the other hand, if there really is an agreement and the oil sanctions begin to get lifted, you're going to end up putting the ~2 oil producer back on the market in full throttle. And at a moment that the Russians are suffering from the fact that oil's down to, $85, $86 a barrel, they're not super eager to see the Iranians come back in. So it's a pretty complicated situation.
So I learned a lot from Gary in the 2 years that I was in the White House, and I spent some time conspiring, or at least hoping, that David wouldn't learn a lot. We almost always failed. But it's really a pleasure to get the two of you together here and shed some light on what is an obviously very complex and unfolding situation. So thank you very much for being here tonight.
Thanks, everyone.